In this video, we're going to be discussing the supply curve and the law of supply. Our supply curve is very similar to our graph for our demand curve. Once we bring both of these concepts together, we're going to be able to establish an equilibrium market price and quantity. To do that, we first have to look at what our supply curve is and how it functions. So again, the supply curve is the relationship between price and quantity supplied, and the law of supply states that as prices increase, quantity supplied also increases. This makes sense. From a supplier or a firm's point of view, the higher the price point, the more the firm is going to want to sell. So the law of supply and the supply curve will always be upward sloping, representing this relationship. In graphical terms, we say this is a direct relationship between price and quantity supplied. Along our curve, this represents various individual firms that are willing and able to supply at various price quantity pairs. Another way of thinking about our supply curve is also as a cost curve. So those that are too low on the industry may not participate, while those at the higher ends will participate. Anytime we have a movement along this curve, we say this is a change in quantity supplied. So if we're just changing our endogenous variables, remember that endogenous variables are price and quantity. They're the variables inside of our model. If we are just changing those and moving along this curve, we say that we have a change in quantity supplied. Just like the demand curve, this supply curve can shift as well. So if we change factors outside of price and quantity, we'll be able to see how this curve shifts. So the mechanics of a supply curve shift are the same as a demand curve shift. When we have an increase in supply, we shift to the right. So this means that at the same price, we're willing to purchase more, and at the same quantity, we're willing to supply more. So this graph can move in a similar way. We can also see a decrease in supply, which is going to be a leftward shift of our curve. So at the same quantity, suppliers now require a higher price, and at the same price, suppliers now want less. So this is the mechanics of our basic supply graph. Just like we had with demand curve, we also have something what's called in this case producer surplus. So just the same way as demanders want to maximize their consumer surplus, producers want to maximize producer surplus. So let's assume that we have a market price. And let's assume that market price is $5. And at a price of $5, let's assume that we have a quantity of 10. Remember that we can think of this supply curve as a cost curve. So if we have a market price that is above our cost, then this is going to be a positive trade for our suppliers. So as long as market price exceeds cost, there's going to be some level of producer surplus. Just like we had with our demand curve, every point along this graph represents a different firm, and together they represent an aggregate. So at lower points on this graph here, we might see different levels of producer surplus. So let's say that an individual firm here has a willingness to pay of $3. If this firm is willing to pay $3, but they have to pay $5, then their producer surplus is going to be that difference between them. So what we want to calculate here is we want to calculate the total amount of our producer surplus. So that's everything above the supply curve and below the market price. So all of this here represents our producer surplus. Again, going through with the calculation for area of a triangle. Area of a triangle is 1/2 base times height. Base times height divided by 2. And this will give us the total amount of our producer surplus. So taking this example, applying this formula, we have 1/2 base times height. So our base is 10 times our height of 5. 10 times 5 is 50. Divided by 2, we get a total producer surplus equal to $25. The goal of our suppliers and the goal of our equilibrium exchange is to maximize our producer surplus. So this is the producer's benefit from the exchange. Again, we can talk about this individually, representing cost and market price received. So various points along this curve, as we had our example with $3, they gain that additional individual producer surplus. But typically we'll be looking at the overall producer surplus in the aggregate. So that's going to be the area of this triangle right here. In the next video, we're going to look at our exogenous factors that can actually shift our supply curve. And we'll go through all of those in our next video. Thank you.